This fly will be a sparkle caddis pupa, which is a caddis emerger pattern developed by Gary LaFontaine, used to imitate caddis as they rise to the surface to hatch into adults. This fly will be tied on a 100 SPBL TMCO hook. In this case it's a size 14, but anywhere from a 14 down to a 20 is about appropriate for this. We're going to tie this one in an olive color, but by varying the color of the dubbing you could match any caddis that hatches on any waters in your area or any other. The thread will be 8/0 brown thread. The dubbing will be Hairtron dubbing, which is rabbit fur and Antron mixed together. It's sort of a sparkly dubbing. The shuck will be 3-ply Antron yarn. This is going to go over the top of the body and create the bubble that encompasses the abdomen of the fly. And the head will be made from some wrapped strands of marabou. To start, we're going to attach the thread just a few eye lengths back from the hook eye, 2 or 3 eye lengths back, and I'll make that thread base all the way back to the bend. And I'll run the thread back up to where I started. Now we're going to prep our bubble out of the Antron yarn, and I've got, this is a 3-ply yarn. I'm going to separate the 3 plies. I'm going to take just one of them. One of the most common things on this fly when you see it tied commercially is it's tied way too heavily. It should be very sparse. So I'm going to take one out of those 3 strands. And I'll lay this here on the table and I'm going to brush this out a bit to separate those fibers and spread them out into a nice sheet. You can see how much bigger that strand got when I brushed it out a little bit. I'm going to take and square the ends of this up and clip them off. And I'm going to tie this down on top of the hook shank just behind our starting point. So I've got that anchored down on top. I'm going to get just a few more turns over this, and I'll use my brush again to sort of separate those fibers. Now I want this yarn to encompass the hook shank, so as I wrap back over it I'm going to push down on the yarn here at the back as I wrap, and that's going to allow those fibers to sort of spread out all the way around the hook shank 360 degrees and come all the way back to the bend. I'll jump my thread back to about midpoint before I start my dubbing now. Now this fly, again, we try to keep this sparse, so I'm not going to use a whole lot of dubbing. And I've chopped this dubbing just a bit so it's a little spikier than your normal rabbit fur dubbing. It's just going to bug out a little bit more, create a little more of an air bubble effect. I'm going to twist this on again tightly. I've cut it so it's spiky, but I don't want to dub it loose. I want to always dub my dubbing tight so it stays attached to the fly. Now on this fly I'm going to also use my thread as a rib. So I'm going to start my dubbing, in this case, at the front of the fly, and I'm going to work back to the bend, making a pretty smooth, level body to start with. And I'm going to build a reverse taper. So I'm going to make the back end of this fly fatter than the front end. And when I run out of dubbing, I want to be with my bare thread right at the bend of the hook. This leaves me in a perfect position to wrap my thread forward over that dubbing to create the rib. So I'll just spiral wrap my thread forward over the dubbing up to the front again. And that creates a nice segmented body that'll be under our bubble. Now I'm going to grab my yarn here at the bend of the hook and I'll spread it out a bit. I'll press my thumb up against the back of it and sort of push it forward so it encompasses the hook shank. We want to make an envelope of these yarn fibers around the shank. So I'm going to push this all forward and I'll try to grab all of them out in front of the hook. And you can see I've got that drawn tight right now. My fingers are beyond the hook point. I'm now going to push my fingers back and that'll sort of bubble that up around the hook. I'll tie this down with 2 or 3 turns of thread and get everything anchored, but I don't want to trim my front ends off just yet. we want a little trailer piece of this yarn to hang off the back of the hook. And it's hard to try to tie one of those in the beginning and not get it to pull forward with everything else. So the trick to this is I'm going to take the tips of my scissors and I'm just going to lift a few fibers up on the top of the fly, and I'll trim those loose and let those hang out the back of the fly. That'll sort of contribute to the shuck on the back end of this pattern. I'll anchor down what's left and trim the butt ends close. And we'll make a thread base over the front edge of the hook so I've got a smooth base to tie on. Now for the head of this, I've always used the marabou rather than ostrich. It's a little more lively in the water. It's a little trickier to work with, but I think it really replicates the natural much better than ostrich herl does. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a few fibers of a really nice bushy marabou feather, and I've probably got 6 or 8 of them here. I'm going to strip those off the feather, and I'm going to tie them in by their tip end. If you think of this like peacock herl or just like an ostrich herl, we're going to treat it much the same way. Like a hackle. You can see when I stretch those fibers out how they'll stand out to the sides of the stem. I'm going to pull those back and divide them, and I'll tie them in about midway up the feather. That gets me into a little thicker stem section, so I'm not worried about it breaking off later. Then I can trim the tips down and wrap over what's left. I'm going to leave my thread hanging right at the hook eye, and you can see these are very short. You may need to use your hackle pliers to wrap these, but we're only going to go a turn or two, so it's not going to take much. I'm going to lift these up. I'm going to wet my fingers just a bit and sort of sweep these fibers back to the back side of the fly. And I'm going to start to wrap here at the front, just one turn in front of the other. And you can see I'm sweeping those fibers back as I go. And this creates kind of a ragged collar. You can see I've lost one strand there. I could just pull that right off. Sort of ragged collar at the front that looks just like the real thing. I'll trim those stub ends off. Wet my fingers down just a bit so I can sweep everything back away from the hook eye and build a small thread head to cover those stubs. And I'll whip finish the brown thread just at the front edge. Now you can see when this dries out a little bit, that collar sort of sweeps back and imitates the head and legs and wing buds of the natural with a really nice effect. This is a really simple fly. It's been around for a long time now, but it's still one of the best caddis emergers ever made.